before we begin, I just need to throw it out there that this video will be long. Anyway, welcome back everyone to another True Crime Time with Junebug. That's me. And this is my first true crime since we announced we're sort of done with YouTube. I'm still gonna make these because I enjoy them and they get, for us, a decent amount of traffic. And by a decent amount for us, it's like a couple hundred views. After your motorcycle. But anyway, today I obviously had heard of this case, and it's like a pop culture one. I think I mentioned in the last video. It's like everyone kind of knows of like the Black Dahlia or Jack the Ripper. I don't think this one's like to that level, but it is still prominently known. Like BuzzFeed Unsolved covered it, so I'm gonna say it qualifies as pretty pop culture-y. But today we are going to talk about Ruth Marie Terry. Now, this takes place in July of 1974, and I always say the ages of the victims in case anything with children bothers you, but Ruth Marie Terry was 37, so not a child. Doesn't make it okay, but not a child. And this takes place in Provincetown, Massachusetts, and the teeny silver lining is it is technically solved now. Whoops. It's technically been solved after like 48 years. So, another long one. A long-awaited one. Now, either you're like me and only know her by her quote-unquote pop culture name, or what she was known as for nearly 50 years. That's how I learned about her. So her other name, the Lady of the Dunes. Like I said, a lot of people probably heard of her. I hadn't until I started like getting interested in true crime. Again, BuzzFeed Unsolved. But in case you're not quite sure who the Lady of the Dunes was, if you're like me and you're like, what? Lady of the Dunes sounds like a lady just hiding in the dunes waiting to get you. Not the case. So let me just give a brief as I can rundown of like who was the Lady of the Dunes? Like what is this pop culture case pertain? So on July 26th of 1974, a poor 12-year-old girl followed a dog in the Race Point Dunes in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And she followed that dog to a decomposing body of a woman. But the body was found not too far from the road and had a lot of insect activity, it said. I do want to note some of this case can get a bit descriptive, so I guess this is a little warning for you. Now, there were also 2 sets of footprints that led to this woman's body. There were tire tracks found not too far from the scene. And they believe the police, because the police were obviously called, they believe she may have died about 2 weeks prior. Now, the woman, this is where it can get a bit intense with the description, but the woman was laying face down on half a beach blanket. A blue bandana and a pair of Wrangler jeans were under her head, like as a pillow. It said she had long red hair and a gold flecked elastic band, like in a ponytail. Very descriptive ponytail holder. Her toenails were painted pink, and she was about 5'6" to 5'8" inches tall, weighed about 145 pounds, and had an athletic build. Also noted there was a bunch of expensive dental work in the woman's mouth, between about $5,000 to $10,000 worth of dental work, and this was in the 70s. This amount nowadays is still a lot for dental work, but imagine how much that was back then. Also, a lot of her teeth were removed. Also, both hands and one of her forearms was missing, like just doesn't, like, not taken by animals. They assume it was kind of, they were chopped off, unfortunately. And they guessed the woman to be between 25 and 40 years old. So quite a range, I think. But I mean, it's probably hard to pinpoint age from a decomposing body. Now, if you thought that was morbid, I'm sorry, but more morbid findings I'm going to list. So it was said she was nearly beheaded, possibly from strangulation. How hard do you have to be strangling someone to nearly decapitate them? That's very intense image. Now, also said one side of her head was crushed by a military type entrenching tool. They believe this was the cause of her death, was the tool. I don't know when the strangulation came into play. Either way, generally not compatible with life. And unfortunately, there were also signs of sexual assault, most likely post-mortem. So not good. They also know there's not really a sign of a struggle, weirdly enough, but guess due to this, she either knew her killer or she was asleep, or maybe both. Now, they believed the reason her hands, teeth, and her forearm were taken or chopped off were to try to hide the killer or the victim's identity, or both. Why not both? And unfortunately, it seemed to work in the killer's favor, because for the next 48 years, the Lady of the Dunes would stay as just that, the Lady of the Dunes. She would be buried in October of 1974 after the case went cold. Now, efforts were obviously made to try to figure out who she was and solve this before burying her, because remember, they found her July and she was buried in October, so some months went by. Now, thousands of missing persons cases were looked through. Lists of approved vehicles driven in the area were looked through, and the surrounding dunes where she was found were searched for evidence as well. All of this, which seems to be quite extensive, trying to find this woman, out who this woman is, nothing came from any of this for 48 years. But they didn't give up, which is nice. Sometimes it feels like they do. 5 years later, in 1979, a clay reconstruction of her face was made to try to get some leads. She would also be exhumed in 1980, but no new evidence came from this. They tried, but nothing new came from it. Now, she would be exhumed again in 2000, so 20 years later, for more DNA testing. And then in 2010, at another decade on top of that, a CT scan of her skull was taken. So NCMEC, the National Center of Missing and Exploited Children, I just call it NCMEC, could make another more updated facial reconstruction of what she might have looked like. And I don't know if her DNA was ever taken again, especially in 2014 when they had to put her in a new casket, unfortunately, because the one they gave her had rusted and deteriorated after decades and being, constantly redug, reburied, redug up, reburied, She needed a new one, but I don't know if they took any DNA again in 2014. And again, nothing was happening. Nothing was being found, at least that they've told the public that I could find. Nothing. They're trying, but nothing is coming to the surface. So she's still the Lady of the Dunes. However, it wasn't just all dead ends. They did have some leads and suspects towards the beginning when they first found her. There was some leads, especially in 1974, there was a lady who told the police the reconstruction, the clay reconstruction, looked like her sister who had gone missing. Turns out it wasn't her sister. I don't know what happened with that woman's sister. I hope they found her. That's the thing that annoys me when I do research like this. And they're like, oh, is it my missing sister? No. And they don't tell me what happened with these other people's missing relatives. I would like to know. Then in 1987, a lady told her friend she saw her dad. A lady told her friend she saw her dad strangle a woman in Massachusetts around 1972. But they couldn't find the actual lady. The friend was the one who told the police. But again, this would have been 2 years prior, and they think the body had only been there maybe about 2 weeks. Again, don't know what came with that. Wish they would have told me, but I don't know. They also thought this woman, Lady of the Dunes, could have been 25-year-old Rory Jean Kissinger, who broke out of jail in 1973. But Rory's mother gave DNA and it did not match the Lady of the Dunes. And by the way, Rory Jean Kissinger hasn't been seen since. she just successfully broke out of jail. So, surprise! They looked into missing women. There was one in particular named Frances Ewalt in Montana, but she was also ruled out. There was another missing woman named Vicki Lamberton, who was from Massachusetts, but that was also ruled out. Again, don't know what happened with either of these ladies, but they were ruled out for being the Lady of the Dunes. Now in 1981, police learned about a woman matching the description of the victim was seen with a very prominent mobster at the time, Whitey Bulger, and he was also apparently known for removing his victims' teeth. I don't know if it was like because it was his thing or if it was because mobsters generally like money. If they had like gold teeth, he was just snatching them. It was said he was known for taking his victims' teeth, and the Lady of the Dunes' teeth, a lot of them were taken. They didn't really have a bunch of evidence for this, and this could never really be proven, but I mean, Whitey Bulger was a whole nother issue with himself. He did kill people, but we don't think he killed the Lady of the Dunes. There was also a serial killer in Massachusetts named Tony Costa, who was thought to maybe be the killer, but he died in May 1974 when the Lady of the Dunes was found July 1974. So that kind of ruled that out as well. There was another murderer they looked into named Hayden Clark, who confessed many times, I might add, to have killing the Lady of the Dunes. Like, he confessed many times, like, throughout the years. It wasn't like many times at the beginning of this case. It was, he just kept going on and on about it. But it was never proven. Like, there was no evidence for this. And apparently he falsely confesses a lot to stuff from what I briefly read about him. Like, he real messed up. He didn't do it. He killed other people, but not Little Lady of the Dunes. There's even, if you know this from pop culture, there was the theory from Stephen King's son that she was actually an extra in the Jaws movie, because it was filmed in this area around this time. Because they actually found, I'll try to get the picture of them zooming in on this extra in the movie who had like the blue bandana and the blue jeans that sort of matched the description, like the clay reconstruction. They thought maybe she accidentally just wandered on the sets. It's kind of out there. Not the most outlandish theory, but it's not really any merit behind it. Now that we talked about who sort of the Lady of the Dunes was, like how she was found and what some theories and suspects were, let's jump ahead to 2022. And I do want to know, there was more theories and dead ends up to this point. I just mentioned the more prominent ones. Now, when the woman's skeletal remains were sent to Othram, and this is how I learned more about this case. Because remember Othram from my Little Miss Nobody, the Sharon Lee Gallegos one, who was unidentified for 62 years. They identified her. Yes, it's that company they sent the Lady of the Dunes skeletal remains to get a DNA map. Not a DNA map, a DNA profile, as it's called, to try and find distant relatives, just like they did for Sharon Lee Gallegos. And Othram came through again. I'm liking them more and more as I do more true crimes and do more research into them, because on October 31st, Halloween of 2022, it was announced the Lady of the Dunes was actually Ruth Marie Terry. Full circle, because I did mention we were talking about Ruth Marie Terry at the beginning of the video, but I had to mention what she was unfortunately known for nearly 50 years, which was the Lady of the Dunes. So let's start at the beginning again. Like, who was Ruth? Who was poor, unfortunate Ruth, who they found murdered in the dunes? Now, Ruth Marie Terry was born September 8th of 1936 in a mountain shack in Whitwell, Tennessee, to Johnny and Ava Terry. It was said her mother would pass when Ruth was very young. Her mom was only 23 when she would pass. We gotta jump ahead to about 1957 when Ruth is about 21. And after a very short marriage, I believe I saw his name was like Billy, not entirely certain, and I don't quite know what happens with that marriage, but it would end. Ruth would actually move to Livonia, Michigan. Hey, Michigan! It's where I live. Not Livonia, though. But she would work at an auto plant, which which is weird. We don't have any of those here. And then in 1958, so a year or less, a little less than a year after her divorce from her first husband, she would give birth to her son, Richard. I'm assuming the husband was the father, but I don't know for certain. I'm just gonna assume it was, given how close the divorce and the baby being born was. Doesn't necessarily mean it's true, just throwing that out there. But after she gave birth, she couldn't afford to raise him, unfortunately. So her boss, of all people, offered to pay off all of her expenses, because apparently she had some debt racked up, if he could adopt her son. I don't know if that's actually what went down, but that's from a couple articles I saw. And she agreed. She was like, sure. So after the adoption was complete, she would move to California. Why California? I don't know. She just did. Later in 1972, so Ruth was about 35 at this time, and her son was about 14, 15 years old, not quite certain. But she was ready to reach out to him and get to know him. But unfortunately, he was not ready to meet her due to him recently having a drug overdose that left him in a coma for 18 days. So he having a lot going on. I could see why throwing meeting your biological mother for the first time into that mix might be a bit stressful. So she did not get to meet her son Richard at this time. And unfortunately, she never would. Now, on February 16th of 1974, Ruth married Guy Rockwell Moldovan. Don't know if I'm pronouncing his last name right, and I don't care. Now, he was an antique dealer in Reno, Nevada. And I do want to point out, notice how this marriage was sheer months before her death. Now, Guy was a bit suspicious. I'm obviously not going into his full backstory, don't want to, don't care to, he don't deserve it, in my opinion. But here are some main suspicious points. He was 13 years older than her, which again, me and Genesis have a 12-year age gap. Being older or having an age gap isn't necessarily a bad thing. Just want to point it out, because sometimes there are creeps out there who just want that hot young lady. Now, Ruth was also his fourth wife. And I don't think he had any known children. I couldn't find any. Maybe he did. I don't know for certain. I didn't see any children. And again, getting divorced, remarried, not necessarily a bad thing. It just, when you put it together with the other things, kind of makes you think. Now, his first marriage was over 10 years. Or no, was like exactly 10 years long. And it seemed normal. I don't know much about it. But her name was Jolene Loop. Jolene. His second marriage in 1958 ended 2 years later. This is where it gets a bit more suspicious. When his wife, Monzie Ryan, and her adult daughter, so his stepdaughter, Dolores, disappeared in Seattle on April 1st of 1960. And he was listed as the prime suspect. And he fled. He fled Seattle at this time after they wanted to question him on it. But he fled. They did find him and arrest him. And I don't honestly know what came from this. Like, he was never, like, jailed or, like, I don't know if he even went to trial. I don't quite know what happened. Maybe a little bit I do, sort of, but that comes later. But I do want to note, this dude lived all over the country. Again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when you pair it with the multiple wives, his second wife and stepdaughter disappearing out of thin air, it just seems a bit suspicious. Now, a couple months after his second wife and stepdaughter disappeared, he would marry his third wife. It's very fast. And her name was Evelyn Emerson. And then he would marry her again 3 years later, I saw. I don't know if they got divorced or if it was renewing their vows, if they weren't legally married the first time. I don't know. I just saw they were married and got married again. Take that for what you will. He would later face larceny charges for taking $10,000 from his wife's family, like swindling them out of it. So that's not very nice. But he also swindled them out of that money around the same time his second wife and stepdaughter went missing. Maybe he's trying to get some money for when he's on the run. I don't know. Now, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for the larceny. But, unfortunately, a judge suspended his sentence and said he just had to pay back the money in like a reasonable amount of time. So, I think he did. I don't know if he did. Even if he didn't, there's no known repercussions that I saw. And we obviously know that him and Ruth would get married in 1974. And knowing what we know now, seems extra not good when Ruth was found mere months later in Massachusetts. So soon after getting married, which their entire marriage was soon after getting married, unfortunately for Ruth, they would start traveling across the US looking for antiques. Remember, he's an antique dealer. They would stop to visit her family in Tennessee along the way of their antiquing adventures. And some relatives would note that Ruth didn't quite seem herself when she was with Guy. They also noted he seemed kind of like possessive of her. They would also, like Ruth and Guy, would visit her half-brother in a different part of Tennessee, I believe Chattanooga. And the half-brother mentioned that Guy mentioned they'd probably hit up Massachusetts at some point. Now, I don't really know what happens next. I tried looking. I don't quite know. But what we do know is Guy would return to Ruth's family later that summer to tell them she's gone. She went missing. I don't know what happened. Bye. And he went back to California. Now, her family, obviously very worried. Makes sense. But her brother, or her half-brother, not quite sure which one, would go back to California with Guy and hire a private investigator to help solve the case. And the PI, he was maybe good at his job? I don't quite know. Or if he was paid by someone, a guy, to give this conclusion. Because he concluded, the private investigator, that Ruth had sold all of her belongings and had left the state willingly to go join a religious cult. So, I mean, maybe he's good at his job, because sometimes I hear cases where PIs just turn up nothing and nothing and nothing. So he did turn something up. If it's true, no. If he was paid to say this, I don't know. Or maybe, what if he wasn't even a real PI? What if Guy was like, I know this private investigator, wink, wink, who could help fix this for us? Who could help figure this out for us? He's real great. But also, if he was a true PI and he wasn't influenced by anyone, I don't know how he came to this conclusion that she just went and joined a cult. I don't know. Now, one of Ruth's relatives believes she may have actually been in a witness protection program. Why? I don't know. But they believe that's why Ruth could not or would not contact them, is because, witness protection program. And unfortunately, this is kind of the end of it again, until she was ID'd in 2022. So I told you the Lady of the Dunes half, this is Ruth's half, how they're converging now into one and the same. So she was ID'd in 2022, but then in 2023, August 28th to be exact, Guy Moldovan was officially named as her killer. Are we surprised? I'm not, but I have all my notes here and I did the research already. Some of you might think from the previous things I told you, that doesn't necessarily mean he's a killer. Just because someone's maybe bad at marriage or handling money. But there are more things that point to him being suspicious. And I have to list those out because I read many articles and I even Googled why do they think Guy Moldovan was the one who killed Terry. I could not find an article that said the reasoning. For the life of me, I could not. So I don't know what exactly led them to that conclusion, if it was DNA, if it was circumstantial, if someone confessed, I don't know. But they did list him as her official killer. But I can certainly see how they would find him guilty. Now, here's some reasons why Guy was probably guilty. Well, first, that whole second wife, stepdaughter just disappearing, a bit suspicious. But also, want to add more to that. They found human remains in his septic tank, like in his sewer system. And they couldn't prove it was them, so I think that's why he was let off the hook. Just gonna ignore the human remains, I guess, and just look the other way. So if that wasn't suspicious enough, him fleeing from the police should also add to that suspicion, as well as stealing money. Granted, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a killer, but still suspicious illegal behavior. Turns out he had a couple different aliases he would use, also kind of suspicious. Also, turns out he was the prime suspect in the murder of Henry Lawrence Bard, who was a 28-year-old truck driver. And he was the prime suspect in the disappearance of Barbara Jo Kelly, who was a 17-year-old waitress. And these happened back in June of 1950. I don't quite know why they suspected him. Again, they didn't dive deeper into that either. But he was the prime suspect for both. So also suspicious. And apparently he wrote, I didn't look too much into it because it sounded disturbing. He wrote a cookbook that was pretty messed up, like cooking with rump oil. And he gave a description. I'll show you, I'll just put it up, the suspicious looking page that they think led him to, this is evidence. This is, you read it, let me know what you think. This doesn't seem like a normal cookbook to me. And nothing happened to him for any of this, for any of these things. Nothing. He had to just pay back the $10,000, if he even did that. Why? Because you're like, oh, but they found out who he was. Maybe, sure, he's old as heck, but they can put him in prison like the Golden State Killer. Wrong. He died in 2002 when he was 78. He is long gone at this point. So, he got away with everything. Everything. If everything is true, like, because again, prime suspect doesn't necessarily mean he 100% did it. Let's be realistic here with him. But if this is true, everything, he got away with murdering 5 people that we know of. He got to live a whole normal life. And unfortunately, karma didn't seem to get him either, because he would get married again. And apparently the 5th time's the charm, because in his obituary, he was survived by, I think her name was Phyllis. I could be totally wrong, but survived by his current wife. He would move back to California, and he was an executive vice president of a silver store on Rodeo Drive. So probably not poor by any means. He just seems to be living life, unfortunately. The only solace, if he truly is this like serial killer, which there is theories that he in fact was, is in his obituary, it said he passed from a quote-unquote lengthy illness. So, this sucks. Poor Ruth's family didn't know what happened to her. Or worse, some of them maybe thought she just left them behind without a thought in the world. And no justice was served. It is definitely nice knowing what happened to her. That's probably great to know. I guarantee you. I haven't been in a situation, but I would love to know. And like, she's back home in Tennessee now. It's just, and they know who killed her, pretty much. It's just, he got away with everything. Now, Ruth's son, remember, Richard, at the very beginning, he is still alive, and he is about 66 years old. And he does regret not meeting her when he had the chance, when he was a teenager, because he would never meet his mother. And he only learned who she truly was after his adoptive parents died. Remember, Ruth's boss back in the day adopted him, and he decided to take a DNA test to learn more about himself and try to find his biological parents. So he took the test in 2018. And actually, it was part of his DNA sample that helped them figure out who the Lady of the Dunes was. He did help find his mother, which would be very nice to know that you had a part to play in that. And unfortunately, he learned what happened to her, so that wasn't great, but it was nice to have peace of mind. Now, I probably will leave the link in the description box below about it's the article I found the most info with him. And there are 3 different clips, I watched all of them, pertaining to this case. The first one features him heavily, and if I'm able to put a clip in of these, I will try. Again, I'm a bit nervous. I don't know if copyright issues or if someone would get mad. I don't know. And I will also leave her current Find a Grave in the description box below, because she was moved from Massachusetts to a marked grave in Tennessee, and they put her right next to her mother in the family graveyard, which I think after 50 years, it's time. She could finally be with her family again. And that's it. Nearly 45 minutes later. I said it'd be a long one. I was not lying. But I remember learning about this, and I just thought it was not fascinating. That feels mean to say. It just bothers me how some cases can just go unsolved for half a century. Because I remember in one of the clips, the family said if they had locked up guy when he was the prime suspect for the killing/disappearance of his second wife and stepdaughter, Ruth would probably still be alive. It's just so sad. Some people's life stories are so sad. And it just amazes me how some people just can just still see the positives in things. Anyway, I'm rambling. So this is a long video, sorry about that. And obviously I didn't cover every single point of the Lady of the Dunes. She was a cold case, unknown victim for 50 years. There's countless theories that I could not cover. But if you want to look more into it, feel free, obviously. And hope you have a good rest of your day and week. And thanks for watching this video, especially if you made it all the way to the end. Hi, Grandma. I know you're a big fan. But I'll see you next time. I don't know what I'm covering. I forgot already. I have it written down somewhere. Let me know what you thought below. Had you heard of the Lady of the Dunes? Were you excited when she was finally identified? I was. Bye, y'all.